So as was said, this is a webinar run by NESTA as part of the Creative Councils process. Creative Councils is run by NESTA. This section, the first section, is very much about looking at the present and the future. So where are we at with public and community engagement? What's going on at the moment? What are the challenges we're facing? And what do we think engagement in the future might look like? And I'll give you some examples that I think are very exciting, and then look at some recommendations. And I'm hoping this will stimulate a very interesting debate. We'll make the slides available to you after the webinar, so you don't have to take notes unless you absolutely want to. So first, a few words about NESTA and Creative Councils. So the Creative Councils process is the NESTA Challenge Prize. It's about innovation in local government. It's supporting 17 councils at the moment. It's really looking for radical innovations, and it's a really broad-based project, very exciting across the 17 councils. There's loads of issues like aging, sustainable transport, growth, dealing with new demands on public services, anything from children in care through to rural transport, looking at engaging with universities as part of a civil society. There's a whole range of issues, lots of interesting ideas. It's a 2-year program. And as a part of this, tools and lessons will be shared with other councils. So Involve has been tasked by NESTA to provide public engagement support. And one of the routes for doing that, we think, is a webinar. It's a short, easy process. People can access it without problems. And hopefully it'll be convenient for you. So we're going to be looking at different aspects of community engagement. In 2 weeks' time, we'll have Sue Ritchie, who will be doing a session on positive deviance. That's really interesting. It's a fascinating process, and she'll be talking about that in detail. So don't miss that. It'll be every 2 weeks on Fridays, around lunchtime, running through February and April. Anyone can attend, and the recordings will be made available. And as I said, further down the line, we'll make sure that you have a chance to input to what the following sessions will be. So I'm hoping that's useful. Those who don't know Involve, we're a charity. We focus on connecting citizens and stakeholders with the institutions that serve them. So it's all about public engagement. It's all about practice and theory, so bridging the theory of the evaluation with actually doing it. And there's loads of resources on our website for those who are interested in it. Indeed, I will reference some of them as we go forward. And I also want to pitch peopleandparticipation.net because it's a great resource for community engagement, but also because it happens to be free. And I realize that is a very strong argument in today's environment. So let's start with today. Let's look at public engagement. So, and as we know, public engagement is a very broad concept. It's basically all the ways in which government tries to connect with citizens, be that around decisions or services, in order to, in some way, improve decisions or improve services. So it's about communication. And why is public engagement becoming more important? It used to be that you voted every few years and that was it. There was very little in the way of engagement between elections. So why are we seeing this upsurge? Well, I think there's a few different things. I mean, one is that the structures of democracy are out of date. So people feel that that democracy isn't, representative democracy isn't delivering what they want. The expectations from the public in terms of how quickly they want a response, whether or not they feel like they should be given a voice, that's changed. People are far more demanding. It's much harder to require legitimacy in terms of whether or not people are willing to accept a decision. And of course, many of the problems that we face in society today, be that traffic congestion, obesity, climate change, these are what I would call co-produced problems. They're problems which need to be solved by society, by citizens. We can't just leave it to government because government wasn't alone in causing the problems. This is why we're seeing this increased focus on engagement. I'd be really interested at this moment to just open up and hear from some of the people in this webinar about what do you think engagement is like today? What words spring to mind when you think about consultation and public engagement as it's happening in councils? So if you use the little icon to raise your hand, then Annie will unmute you and call on people to just say a few words, maybe a sentence or two about what you think about engagement today. Do we have any volunteers, Annie?
Not yet, no. Can you see the little hand icon? There may be a bit of a delay with it coming through. Here we are. So, Margot Rohan, I'm just going to unmute you. Hi, Margot. Margot?
Hi, Margot. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes,
yes,
fantastic.
absolutely.
Yes, fantastic. I'd just say that the problem with community engagement today is cynicism. People are fed up with consultations that they don't think are consultations. So I'd say the difficulty is cynicism. When you try to engage, people don't believe it's going to be fruitful.
And where do you think that cynicism is coming from?
I think it's people are fed up with consultation being constantly mentioned, and initially the idea was, you were being consulted, your ideas would be taken in account. But there are so many consultations, and people feel that, particularly with local government, that they're just going through the motions so they can tick the box to say they're consulted, but they don't feel that they get the feedback, because I think local government is very bad at actually communicating back. So even if they have taken feedback that they've got into account, they're not very good at communicating that they've taken into account and the reasons why they're not necessarily doing what the feedback's asked for. So people have become very cynical about, they think, why bother for us to put our views forward if nobody seems to take any notice.
Thank you. That's really a very useful point. Does anyone else agree with that or have a different view?
So, Paul Bumstead, I've just unmuted you. Do you want to say a few words?
Yeah, thank you. I completely agree with what Margot just said. The cynicism does very much arise from this lack of a real impact on so-called consultations, which appear to be based on, well, this is what we've decided is going to happen. We'll let you have a sort of a voice, but it won't really change things. In other words, it'll fiddle around with the little bits and pieces, but it won't really change the nuts and bolts of anything. In my own particular council area, we had, as many people realize, serious rioting back in August. And one thing that's come out from that rioting was people saying, they don't listen to us, they don't care. And unless we can get around this and get this right the way through the community, then we have a serious problem with that engagement, and the cynicism and the dissatisfaction will carry on growing.
Thank you. Yes, so that's another voice in support of that view. There's a problem with consultation at the moment then. Fantastic. Other points of view?
We haven't got any other hands up that I can see at the moment. Oh, here we have. Yes, we are.
Okay. Fantastic.
Would you like? There are another couple, Edward. Should we have a few more?
Yeah. Yeah. Why not?
So, Kathy Sharp.
Hi. I'm in Edinburgh, despite my accent. Can you hear me?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. I agree very much with what Margot said. The word feedback, I think, is really interesting. I'm remembering earlier last year, an Edinburgh Council tenant said to me in an event I was involved in that he didn't like the word feedback. He thought it become a cliche. Because for exactly the reason that people have described, because it's all that one-way thing. And I think it's probably important that we think about feedback in the way it's used in more systems thinking, and that it isn't about, you tell us what you think about our services. It's very much a two-way process, and it's about a dialogue, essentially. And that becomes, if you like, almost like a driver of the engagement process because it feeds on itself.
Yeah. That's a really interesting perspective of bringing in systems thinking and looking at consultation as something quite different and engagement as something quite different as than it's conceptualized today. Thank you for that.
Thanks.
Sani, did we have another?
No, no more from
Question
us.
or two? No? Okay, fantastic. So that's really useful, and I have to say I'm not surprised by those findings because it's echoed across the work that we do, and we speak to people in local government, in health, and indeed with citizens themselves. We did a 2.5-year research project funded by the Big Lottery Fund, together with Institute for Volunteering Research and with the NCVO, called Pathways Through Participation. So we spoke to lots and lots of people across 3 sites in the UK, and we did 101 in-depth interviews. I mean, really sat down and really talked things through with people. And we didn't have a single person who said anything positive about government consultation. Now, that's quite a damning result, and it does show that there is a key problem, which you've already all highlighted here, about engagement today. And I mean, if I were to summarize the 3 problems, I think, is that firstly, we're dealing with a very narrow band of people and a very narrow band of methods. I'd say the great majority of local government consultation consists of public meetings, put a big document up on the website and ask for feedback. We tend to reach a very narrow band of people, you know, the people we call the usual suspects. We tend to do engagement very late in the day when many decisions are already made and there's very little scope for influencing the things that citizens maybe did want to have change. And of course, engagement today is very institutionally focused. It's very focused on what do we, the council, we, the primary care trust, we, the hospital trust, we, the police force, get out of this. So we've had a comment from Sally about the consultation engagement. Isn't that a more mixed picture? And there's good and bad examples. Absolutely. I don't want to paint too bleak a picture. There's obviously good consultation and good engagement going on, and that's what we're going to come on to. However, I would say that a lot of engagement falls, in my personal opinion at least, falls short of the what you should be able to expect from it. It's not being used to its fullest potential, and it's not really making the most of the time and effort that citizens are putting into it. We'll get on to that in a moment. But I think that if we look at the narrow band of people we reach late in the day and institutionally focused, those are the 3 key problems, I think, with engagement as it's practiced. And in a while, we're going to look at some examples which I think change those dynamics, different ways of approaching doing engagement. I wanted to just quickly reflect on some of the changes we've seen in policy. So we've got the Localism Act come through. There's a number of changes in government, and it's interesting to reflect on the differences between perhaps what happened before, and I don't think this is a political point. I think this is more to do with the way the operating environment has changed. In the years before the financial crisis, engagement and consultation were often about what government can do to you. And I think this quote perhaps is one of the most extreme ones I've ever said. This is a definition of empowerment as the giving of confidence, skills, and power to communities to shape and influence what public bodies do for or with them. So there, empowerment is something that government actually gives to people. And oftentimes engagement was couched in terms of what government does, government resources. Participatory budgeting was always about government money and how public want government to spend money. And if you look at the debate around the big society, and even amongst people who don't agree with the concept of the big society, there seems to be a shift away from just what government can do, but to looking at how do we untap potential in communities. How do we, so as opposed to giving confidence, it's about focusing on doing the things only government can do, and then individuals should identify and solve problems in the way that they wish to solve them. So that's an interesting shift. We can debate its merits, but I think that shift has had a lot to do with the fact that we are much less confident in government's ability to pay its way out of problems and fund problems out of existence. So I think some trends that are having an impact are we're seeing far fewer resources, which is having a big impact on the kinds of engagement that's going on. Especially at central government level, we're not seeing these massive processes anymore. We're seeing a massive amount of increased conflict. I don't know if anyone in the webinar has had an experience of a judicial review or a other kind of conflict, but that's something which has certainly increased massively the last few years. And also a shift, I think, from focus on decision making in engagement to a focus on delivery. So we saw the duty to involve disappear, and the duty to involve was largely about decision making, and instead we've got the right to bid, right to run services, etc. So there seems to be a shift away from engagement just around decisions into a shift looking at engagement as part of delivering services. And indeed, co-production has become a term which is very widely used. And if we look at conflict in particular, I think obviously the cuts are having a big driver of this. People are very angry about the cuts, and even when you're doing consultation or engagement which has nothing directly to do with cuts, if it's on a topic where there have been recent cuts, then that will come up in the conversations quite naturally. If people are very angry about an issue, it doesn't really work to say, well, this is not the meeting about that, because they'll want to have their say on that particular topic, and that can be difficult to deal with. We've also got the rise of a culture of litigation, judicial review, challenges, and quite a number of councils have now had to redo consultation in terms of, because cut decisions, especially around cuts, have been deemed to be unlawful because they haven't been consulted about properly. Now, I am worried about that process, because I think what that leads to is a sense of the public, that it becomes an issue about judges deciding whether or not a consultation is good. And it also encourages councils to spread their consultation budgets far too broadly. So you cover your back, you do consultation on absolutely everything, just to make sure you don't end up in the courts. But of course that means that you have very little resource per consultation, and you can't actually spend the resource that's needed for the really key issues. And then of course, lastly, this is often overlooked, we've got the intra-community conflicts, the conflicts between communities, which often put local government in a very difficult position. So that's something we're going to see in the next few years, increased problems around that. So as I said, the current engagement landscape as it stands, lots of written consultation, lots of public meetings, satisfaction surveys and questionnaires. I don't know if you agree with that. My experience on the ground is the majority of local government consultation today is made up of these kinds of methods. And we will get on to look at some of the other ways of doing things. But before we get on to looking at the other ways of doing things, I just wanted to reflect on, I think, the fundamental reason why oftentimes why consultation fails. I think this is the key reason in most cases. We often start with the process or the structure. We start with the how. How are we going to reach this? And this is especially true when you've got a method which you're either very, very familiar with, like, say, a focus group, or one which has come in and which is exciting, so Twitter. So if you start with the process and you say, well, actually, we need to be on Twitter. The council needs to be on Twitter because, it's the new thing. And we expect that Twitter is going to give us the outcome that we want. But of course, it doesn't work that way, and oftentimes we get very disappointed with starting with the method. What we instead need to do is to start with the purpose. We need to fully understand why we're trying to engage. Is it about communicating, so passing out information to the public? Well, then maybe Twitter is a good solution. Is it about entering into a dialogue? Well, if you're entering into a dialogue, then maybe those 130 characters, 140 characters, won't be particularly useful for that purpose. Are you looking to get more information from the community? Are you looking for the community to self-organize? Are you looking for the community? Are you looking for more legitimate decisions? What is it you're looking for? The why is an absolutely crucial part of this. If you don't understand why, the method choice will be ill-informed, because different methods are good for different things. The second thing is the context. I mean, where are you doing this? Is this an area which has good or bad broadband access? Is this an area which has, what's the history of it? Without understanding your context, it's very hard to know whether or not the method is appropriate. And without understanding the people, without understanding whether or not people are actually online and able to access Twitter, you won't actually know whether or not the method is the right one. And it's only when you know why, where, and who that you can make an informed decision about how to engage them. And it's those four things together which will give you the outcome that you're looking for. So hopefully that's clear. I think that's oftentimes we start with the how rather than looking at the three other areas, which I think are very important. So that's about the now, the here and now when it comes to public engagement. Let's look at the future of engagement. And the thing about the future, it's often hyped up. We often think it's these impressive looking robots and strange looking things, and of course then we a few years later look back and wonder where our jetpack went. So I'm going to say to treat what I say with caution. This is an actual quote from the New York Times from 1903. The flying machine, which will really fly, may be evolved by the combined and continuous efforts of mathematicians and mechanicians in from 1 million to 10 million years. The reason I say this is because us humans are really bad at predicting the future. So don't get me wrong, I'm not saying don't quote me on this. Please quote me on what my predictions and my analysis, but then feel free to laugh at me if and when I get it wrong. So this is my best guess based on what I'm seeing, what I'm experiencing, and what I'm seeing from other sources. And I'd be really interested to hear your views on it and to get a sense from you whether or not you think it's feasible, whether or not you think that's what you're seeing or not in your lives. So one of the key areas where people talk a lot about, where people think this is where it's going, is online. What about technology? What does technology allow us to do? And I think online engagement is a fantastic area, and a lot of people are shifting online at the moment. Sometimes they're doing it for the wrong reasons, though. And at the moment, there's a lot of focus when it comes to online about speed. We say, oh, the internet made things so much faster. But actually, I think that's not really, that's missing the point about the internet. Because if it's really about the speed of information, then the big shift that happened was much earlier than the internet. So it took, in 1812, the Battle of New Orleans was fought 2.5 weeks after the war was over between the US and Britain, because no one knew it was over, because it took 3 weeks to send information over the Atlantic. In 1865, it took 11 days, and then in 66, when they laid the first transatlantic cable, the telegraph, it shrank to 1 minute. So actually, speed, yes, it is faster today than it was previously, but actually that's not the big shift. One of the key shifts is around cost of reproducing information. And this is a fascinating bit of calculation that I found online. How much does it cost to reproduce a book? So how much would it cost me to create a new book? Well, in 1011, when I had to do it by hand, the equivalent 2001 US dollar equivalent is $17,000 per book. That's quite pricey. 500 years later, when you've got the printing press, it's shrunk to about $57. And today, when you just put a nominal fee to just the cost of doing an electronic copy, it's almost nothing. And that's radically changed. If you look at some of a lot of the YouTube clips are ridiculous and stupid and make little sense. But actually, if you think about the production costs that it would have cost people to reach that audience and produce that material, say 10, 15 years ago, it's absolutely astounding. So it's opening up a whole world of what's possible. And of course, what that means is you can now equip. It used to be that participatory video was quite resource intensive. You had to train young people or whoever you were working with to use the video cameras. You had to loan them the video cameras. They had to come back with the tapes. They had to process them. And of course, nowadays, for most young people and many adults, you can just say, well, go out in your local area, use your phone, and take pictures, take videos of what you see, and send them back to us. Group them on a Google map. And actually, you've got a system which, in the past, would have been incredibly difficult and expensive to do. I also think sometimes we focus on the wrong things when it comes to online. So a lot of the focus at the moment has been around e-petitions. So a lot of focus on e-petitions. E-petitions are seen as a big thing. Now, when I think about whether or not digital technology is a revolution or an evolution, I ask, well, what would I do if I didn't have the digital equivalent? And in the case of e-petitions, well, what would I do if I didn't have e-petitions? Well, I'd probably be doing paper petitions. And while e-petitions may be faster and it's much more convenient for me to not have to stand out in the rain and get wet, it's actually quite nice. It doesn't radically change what the petitions do. Whereas some of the less celebrated things, like, for example, they work for you. Here's my MP, for example. At the moment, I can look at her voting record, I can search for what she said, I can look at her interests, her expenses, all of this stuff. But 10, 15 years ago, when I would have been perfectly happy to go off and do a paper petition, what would I have had to do to get that information? Well, I would have to go through every written record of Hansard, line by line, and try and find occasions when Lynn Featherstone mentioned one thing or another. It would have been incredibly time-consuming. So actually, and this is also interesting because there is mashups. Where people you can compare their members' interests with how their voting record, and that would have been almost impossible to do previously. So the power of the internet and digital technology is it's allowing us to join up information and make things visible, and it's allowing the public to do that as well. So there's a lot of exciting things going on online, but sometimes we focus a little bit much on things that are an evolutionary shift rather than a revolutionary shift. It's also worth noting that I'm very much from the view that technology isn't the solution. It opens doors, but actually, unless you understand your participants, unless you understand your purpose, online processes can be an absolute waste of time. And I would also say that if the sole driver of moving things online is that it's cheaper, then that can be a false economy, because it can be very expensive to provide paper-based solutions to a very small number of people. I do support more online engagement, e-participation, use of social media. I think it's great, but I think we need to be clear about why we're doing it, and the cost reason is not necessarily the strongest one. So I've got two quotes here. One that says, "The world is poised on the cusp of an economic and cultural shift as dramatic as that of the Industrial Revolution," and one which says, "The Internet's a telephone system that's gotten uppity." And I think both are true. I think on one level, the opportunities presented online are absolutely phenomenal, but actually we also need to recognize that it hasn't changed human nature. And the same factors that can make public meetings an absolute nightmare to manage can also make an online forum an absolute nightmare to manage. So we need to be aware that human nature hasn't changed. Just because you move engagement online doesn't automatically make it better, faster, quicker, more responsive. But that said, the technology is absolutely phenomenal in terms of making some things possible that would be absolutely impossible to do before the widespread use of computers. So just sharing a few principles on online engagement, which I think I've gone through with you already. This is from the Armchair Involvement toolkit that we developed a few years ago. It's worth looking at if you're interested in new technologies and how to use those. Now let's look at another area which has also been very popular recently, which is crowdsourcing. And many of you have heard of the spending challenge, the Your Freedom site. Basically, crowdsourcing, according to the white paper definition, is when a job which is traditionally performed by a professional is outsourced to a group of a wider, undefined group of people in the form of an open call. So this might be mining companies have, for example, released all their geological data onto the net and have then said, well, actually, can others look at this data and come up with a sense of where we should be digging for gold? And the results they've been getting back from a wide search is much better than they would have gotten with a small group of experts. It's this idea of the wisdom of the crowd. It's been very popular. It's, I think, achieved mixed results in terms of actual impact. And again, it comes back to the fact that people are using it for the wrong reason. So why would you crowdsource? Well, there's 4 basic reasons. One is tapping into this idea of the wisdom of the crowd. And that's what governments have tried to do recently. The problem with that one is it only works if there is one true answer. If you're trying to find gold and you release your geological data and the kind of experts and hobby geologists look over it, there is a clear, correct answer and there's wrong answers, and you can quickly find out which is which. However, public policy often doesn't work that way. So using crowdsourcing to come up with the right solution, in quotation marks, isn't always a good approach. However, it can be a great way of accessing information that's highly distributed. And we'll move on to talk about an example of that, which is very powerful. Another way is to find out the preferences of the crowd, which is similar to what we do today when we carry out satisfaction survey. It's about making an open call and saying, well, actually, what would you prefer of these various options? And then the 4th one is actually uncovering those killer ideas, the policy innovation, uncovering new ideas that are hidden in the crowd. And that's really what the spending challenge has been about. It's about looking at areas and asking people to come up with innovative new solutions. Now, the problem with that one is oftentimes the one innovative idea might be hidden in thousands or tens of thousands of other responses. So the tricky thing is actually having a system for uncovering the good ideas, but then, of course, also asking the right people. So, for example, I would argue that when you're dealing with public spending and asking for efficiencies, it's proven to be much more useful to ask public sector workers than it has been to ask members of the public. Because members of the public, at least if you frame the question in a very general, across the public sector as a whole, where do you think we should make savings? Because the public are very angry about things like MPs' expenses, which of course form a very tiny proportion of the overall pot. Whereas the people who work in the public sector often have inside information about what works and what doesn't. So that's a little bit about crowdsourcing. And you might have questions about crowdsourcing or online stuff, and do make a note of those, because we will be coming on very soon to sections about where we'll do have some questions and answers. So let's have a look at the moment. This is the section that we're about to look at is very much based on an upcoming pamphlet we're doing with the Royal Society of Arts, which we're calling Radical Engagement, where we're taking a fresh look and saying, well, what is happening at the moment when it comes to public engagement, which is really exciting and very different and pushes the boundary. Because oftentimes in all kinds of fields we come up against barriers. Like in aviation, they came up against the sound barrier, which put a real dampener on the development of aircraft. And it wasn't until they figured out a way to break through the barrier and move on that they could develop further. And in some ways you could look at the current state of at least some consultation and some engagement, or certain as such a barrier, that we've reached the limits of what you might call traditional consultation, and we need to explore new ways of doing it. That doesn't mean that traditional consultation is wrong or bad and we should stop doing it. It just means it doesn't actually meet the requirements of certain situations, and we need to develop new tools. So let's have a look at radical engagement. And because I like quotes, I'm going to give you one again. This is a quote which some people have attributed to Albert Einstein, although that's disputed. But it's a good quote. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And to a certain degree, that is actually what I think a lot of local councils are doing when it comes to engagement. We run a public meeting, we get shouted at. People are angry, leave angry, and then we do the same thing again. We do another public meeting, we get shouted at. We do another public meeting, we get shouted at. And actually, we need to start finding ways of doing things differently, radically differently, in order to achieve radically different results. So as I said, just to reiterate, current activity, current engagement, current consultation, lots of activity, but a very limited range of methods in my experience. Now, of course, in any council, there will be pockets of good practice. There will be areas where people are doing more or less. That might be in youth services, for example. Youth engagement is often a little bit more innovative than other forms of engagement, partly because, luckily for them, young people have not yet to develop the unfortunate politeness that allows them to sit through some quite dull meetings. So there are some things that we need to look at here. And if we look at radical engagement, the examples that we've looked at, they're very diverse. But oftentimes, this is what distinguishes them. They start with the lived experience of citizens. So that means rather than focusing on exclusively or mainly on what does government get out of this, actually trying to understand citizens. What are the issues that citizens understand as important? What are the natural geographical units which citizens can relate to? What are the places where people would like to meet? What are the times when people would like to meet? Place the citizen at the center of your engagement. The second aspect is oftentimes it's not just a research process. It's not just about getting citizens to talk. They're not just a talking shop. It's actually about the citizen problem-solving capacity, so that when citizens leave the process, they're better able to deal with problems at the local area. And we will be, in the next webinar, we'll be talking about positive deviance, which is all about that. It's all about training citizens to be expert problem solvers and expert researchers in order to overcome problems which are seemingly impossible to meet. So if you're interested in that, I would definitely come back in 2 weeks' time and listen to Surichi talk about it. Radical engagement tends to be designed with a long-term impact in mind. One of the case studies we've looked at is from Western Australia and Geraldton, where they're currently running a 4 or 5 year engagement process with a view to a much longer. So they're actually looking at their engagement as a whole throughout that period, designing web platforms which they anticipate will last that time. They're designing regular meetings which tie in different ways for people to access things. We need to move away from looking at engagement or consultation as one-off projects and looking at as ongoing. And I really like the analogy used earlier about the systems thinking, looking at this as an ecosystem or a network. Making sure that we use the right incentives, because why do people take part? Well, the Pathways research showed many reasons. I mean, one of them is making a difference. But fun is so crucial to many people and the reason they take part. And it's often overlooked. Food and drink can be a massive incentive, can have a disproportionate impact on people's willingness to take part. And yet, sadly, it's also one of the things that we cut back on first in times of austerity, even though it actually can have an impact far beyond the cost. Making the most of behavioral science is also really important, making sure that people, that we design our processes in a way which goes with the grain of human behavior, not against it. And finally, making sure that we personalize engagement opportunities, that regardless of whether or not you have lots of time on your hands or very little, there is an engagement opportunity for you. If you like engaging online, there's a way of doing that. If you like doing it face-to-face, there's a way of doing that. And it's interesting to look at the early attempts of AlphaGov, for example, so the government web platform, which is looking to create a web page which personalizes itself, remembers who you are and what you're interested in, and then personalizes it so you can find the information you're most likely to want quicker than if it was a generic website. And again, technology starting to give us that ability to do that. So that's some of the principles behind it. And let's talk about some of the examples we're going to look at. These are from around the world. What about Imagine Croydon? Let's do it Estonia, Our Budget, Our Economy from the States, Manila, Philippines, Flood Map, and the Healthy Democracy Citizens Initiative Review in Oregon. So these are some really interesting examples that I'm very passionate about, very excited about talking to you about, because I think they represent what we might see in the future when it comes to public participation and public engagement. Before I move into those, though, I think it would be great if we could just have a few minutes for any questions or any items for discussion that people would like to raise based on what we've talked about so far. So if you have anything to say, please raise your hand electronically, and Annie will pass the word around.
Hi Edward, just waiting for the hands to come up. I think there's a bit of a delay. Oh, fantastic. Andy McGregor. Are you there, Andy?
Yeah, hi. I don't know whether you can hear me or not. Just one of the things that I think the biggest threats to engagement and involvement is cynicism of the population. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I don't think there is a short-term solution to it. I think it has to be a case of actually, in part, it's about. So there's several sides to this. I mean, one is that we need to start making the case for doing less engagement and less consultation, and just if we believe that if we've made our minds up already, then just being honest about that, and not so avoiding doing show consultations, because people pick up on that very quickly. The second thing is there's the communications problem, because I've been to many councils and many government departments where if you ask the people who ran the consultation if it made a difference, they all say yes. If you ask the citizens who took part, they won't feel it made a difference because no one's actually told them, no one's put it into their words. And in part, this comes back to this thing about if a politician changes his or her mind, we view that as something negative. So the politicians and councils will go out and they'll say, please have your say, we really want to listen to your views. But of course, if the council or the politician then changes their mind, that's never presented as such. It's always like, well, this is what I was going to do anyway. So there has to be an element of acknowledging where citizens have made a difference and publicizing that quite widely so that people get that feedback and they can see a result of their participation. But I also feel that sometimes we worry a lot about being honest with citizens. Most citizens appreciate the fact they can't get what they want every time. And they also appreciate being told very clearly that this is a very limited consultation, and the issues that you are interested in probably won't be covered, because people are very busy and they don't appreciate spending time responding to consultations which turn out to be where actually what they wanted wasn't even on the table to begin with. More broadly than that, I think there is something here about changing the way in which we engage. There are some things we do which make people more cynical. There is partly the language we use when it's very jargonistic, and when we approach consultation in a very formalistic, step-by-step attitude. What tends to happen is citizens view it as a done deal or quite alien, quite tiring, quite boring. I think especially in planning, for example, which is one of the most regulated engagement areas, people are often very cynical about it because it feels like they're jumping through hoops. It feels like it has to go, certain things have to happen at certain times. But there's no real energy or no real feel, no enthusiasm, no sense that it's actually going to change something. So those are some of the areas I think where we can do more work in terms of reducing cynicism. Questions or
Fantastic.
comments?
Any other questions? That looks like that's, oh, here we are, John Popham. Hi, John. John, are you speaking into your microphone at the moment? Hi, John, are you there?
Hello. Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Fantastic. Yes, we can.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Brilliant. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I just want to make two points really. One about the cynicism issue, and I speak to somebody who was a political activist for a long time. I think one of the things that causes cynicism is party politics. I think most people's concerns don't fit into party political bags, but the problem is that the politicians try to make them do that, and I think people feel it gets distorted. And I also feel that the politicians just turn the issues into political arguments, and it doesn't fit in with the way they see things. So that's one thing. And the other thing I think is the very important point that you made, Ed, about these needing to be fun. Is that people have busy lives. Why do we expect them to turn out at dry, boring, dull consultation meetings? We need to go with the flow of their lives, make this fit into something that they enjoy doing, and fit in with something they probably will be doing already anyway. So I think...
Yeah, thank you. Those are two very, very important points. And the party politics thing is very true. We did the pathways research, and what was so clear was people just detest, they detest politics, party politics, and they detest being termed political. So we've had parish councillors who've refused, I'm not political. There's a very strong undertone that people would be, one of the things that's putting people off becoming active in their local community is they're worried about being seen as politicians. And they desperately do not want to be seen to be politicians. So absolutely, that's a big part. And the fun aspect is also really important. The fun aspect is also really important. Excellent. Any other comments?
So I think John was trying to respond actually then. I can't quite hear. John, if you send me a message, I might be able to come back and send that on to Edward. Send me a message. I might be able to come back and send that on to Edward. Okay.
Okay, we seem to have some kind of massive feedback. So,
does anybody else want to say anything? Okay. I think that's it for now, Edward.
Thanks for your patience, by the way. Yeah, it's a very doing webinars can be quite challenging in that there's no way of actually seeing people's reactions in real time. But if you do have comments or questions, do chat them off to Annie if you need them. Let's look at these examples because I'm really passionate and excited about them. If we start with Croydon, so imagine Croydon was a big process that was aiming to develop a longer-term plan for Croydon. Now these are very common. They're not always very exciting. Oftentimes they just become documents which lie on shelves, and the impact and the input from citizens is very limited. Now Croydon did a very large process a couple of years back, which included lots of different things, and it was a lot of it was about fun. It was about going and doing activities which people thought were fun. So when there are fun days or festivals, asking people to write cards about if you were on a holiday in 2040, what would you like to be able to describe Croydon as being? So it says, safe, friendly environment, not overcrowded, crime is low. That's information from people who would never come along to a public meeting, would never take part. It's that informal engagement, going to people where they are and doing activities which are fun, video booths, other things like that. But one of the most exciting things they did in Croydon was they worked with young people, and they developed scenarios. So I think over about 10 weeks, a small group of young people in each school were given a scenario where they were asked to put themselves in the position of the council. So that might be about spending on traffic, and they were given different options about how they could spend the money. Would they use it for cycle lanes or carpooling clubs? Or an improved bus service. Different, really tough choices presented to these young people who were then asked to go out in their schools and in their communities and consult with a broader range of stakeholders and then report back. So every week they would consider the options, they would go out and consult, they would come back and they would write up a press release as if they were the council, explaining why they decided to spend money a particular way, and they sent it back in. And these results were posted on a web page where people were able to interact with them and comment on them. And at the end of the 10-week period, the school, which had created the most useful and consistently good points, was given a prize. And the manager I spoke to in Croydon said, well, it used to be, engaging young people was like pulling teeth. You couldn't get them engaged; it would never come up. And here, when for a few weeks they got a little bit delayed, a day or two, with sending out the scenarios, and they were bombarded by emails from the young people demanding to know where their scenario was because they were itching to get on with it. And, you know, in a way, the questions they asked weren't very different from what they would have asked in a normal survey or anything. What changed was the way they framed it. They ran it like a game, as if it were a computer game like SimCity or something similar. And they added an element of competitiveness. And all of a sudden, people's conception of what it was they were doing changed completely. And it might be that if you ask some of these young people, have you ever been consulted, they might say no, because they don't see it as a consultation. It's a fun activity that they're doing for the enjoyment of it. And the fact that Croydon is getting useful information from it is a side issue. So this is, I think, just interesting to look at. And I don't think informal engagement has to be more expensive than regular engagement. It's just a matter of how you spend the resource and whether or not you're willing to get, is it about getting lots of data from one or two, from a broad range of people, or is it actually about getting the quality data? So that's Imagine Croydon, which I think is a great example of innovative engagement. Now let's look at My Estonia. And this is a really interesting example of decentralized co-production. In Estonia, they had a big problem with littering and fly tipping. The government couldn't really afford to do anything about it because the finances were quite bad. So what they did was they organized with partners in civil society, they organized a community cleanup day. They got people to, using a Google Map style application, to identify where there were problems, where has stuff been dumped and fly tipped. So they quickly gathered together a very good decentralized map of where there were littering problems in Estonia. They then got members of the public to self-organize. So local volunteers would say, I will organize a cleaning crew if 5 other people join me, and we'll meet here at that time. Now on the day, back in 2008, they got 50,000 people showing up on one day to clean the area, to clean up in Estonia. So this is of a population of about 1.5 million. That's an absolutely tremendous result. There were calculations done later that said that for government it would have taken something between sort of 20 times more money, and what was done in one day would have taken about 5 years to do. So it's a pretty impressive result. And on the back of that, they've done 2 things. One is they've also done community brainstorming sessions, which attracted about 10,000 people the next year to look at what they could do for themselves in their communities. The second thing is they've actually taken the Let's Do It, My Estonia process, and they're now doing something called Let's Do World, where they're trying to do exactly the same thing across the world. And they've done processes in India, in Korea, in all parts of Europe and the US. So it's really taken off as a decentralized network of people trying to improve their local area. So it's exactly the kind of example of this would not have been possible without the internet, and it builds momentum. So that's a great example. It's very hard to replicate on its own, but it shows the potential that actually if you're able to build a network which allows people to self-organize, you can get some pretty stunning results. We then move on to look at Our Budget, Our Economy, which is a, so we've had a question here about Imagine Croydon. What was the impact of Imagine Croydon? I don't know if anyone is here from Croydon. My understanding is because the big engagement happened just before or just during the early stages of the financial crisis, before the cuts started, the strategy developed has needed to be revised quite heavily. So I'm not sure in terms of an impact Imagine Croydon is a great example. And it's not because the process was flawed, it's just because reality often interjects when we're doing things. We have to be honest with ourselves when our process has failed, and also in the cases where the process is fine, but actually the messiness of reality has intervened. I think what I was impressed by with Imagine Croydon was the fact that it, as a process, used many different routes to get to people who would never have taken part otherwise. And it used routes working through schools, through civil society groups, in a way which actually wasn't very expensive as compared to trying to reach those groups through regular means. So I hope that answers the question about what the impact was from Imagine Croydon. And if there are any more questions, then do do send them through.
Can I read out another one, Edward?
Yes, please.
Which has just come through. It's a comment as well as a question. It's from Giles Prideaux, and he said he's talking about fun and engagement, and in youth engagement, and he says it's fun, but it's better when youth are allowed to prototype some new services within their high schools, for example. I mean, he says that sometimes fun could also be seen as an achievement, like online social reporters or something like that.
Ooh. Absolutely, and I think we need to look at fun as quite a broad thing. I mean, it can be just about you know, having a laugh, having building in some time for social interaction, but it can also be as you mentioned, an achievement or some kind of personal fulfillment, actually seeing something you've done in print. There's lots of things like that which are a vital part of why people choose to get involved. So those all vitally important points. So thank you, Giles, and thank you, Sally, for sending those through. So if we look at the Our Budget, Our Economy process, this was done in America. It's an organization called America Speaks, which does deliberative processes. And the problem that they have in the States is obviously this massive polarization where you've got the Tea Party and the Occupy movement, you've got the hard right Republicans who want to slash government spending and reduce taxes, and you've got the left-leaning Democrats who feel that the solution to this is to increase taxation of the rich and safeguard many of the spending challenges. And there's no overlap, there's no common area of agreement, and that's a problem that we're going to increasingly face in the public sector when we're dealing with cuts, because different community groups will come up against each other and there'll be massive conflict. Now, what America Speaks did was that they worked with universities to come up with relatively neutral materials which explain the trade-offs and the different sides. They had people present from different backgrounds their views about why they thought certain things needed to happen, and then they went out and recruited as close to a average selection of Americans as they could. So they worked through non-political groups to get people to come to conversations. And the way that those conversations were held was incredibly varied. So sometimes that was about coming to a big hall with 500 other people and sit at small tables and discuss it. Other times it was about logging. Some people it was about hosting a kitchen table conversation with people in their community, which was then linked to these bigger conversations via the internet. And in the face-to-face meetings, they used wireless voting pads and laptops as a way of quickly gathering the views of the whole room and feeding it back. And it was interesting to see how they did see a moderation of views. They did find that people were, when faced with views that were not the same as their own, they were able to overcome differences and come up with ideas about how to solve issues, which is really quite powerful. And this is an example of a deliberative process. Now, deliberative processes are quite resource intensive, and so you need to use them wisely. But when you're dealing with a situation where there seems to be no clear solution, where there is massive gridlock and the experts fundamentally disagree, then actually a deliberative process can really cut through things in a way which can be very powerful, and also show that sometimes politicians who may view things as being incredibly gridlocked, they often need to see that citizens can reason around these issues. So I think deliberative processes won't be something that we do every day, but they will be a vital part of the toolbox going forward. Then I want to look at an example. I promised you an example of crowdsourcing, and this is a great example from a professor in the Philippines, in Manila. And when there was flooding a few years back, what he did was he set up a Google map, which was originally an immediate response to the flooding, where people could log their, could let the authorities know that they were having, that they were stranded or they needed help, because the emergency services, their numbers were absolutely swamped. So it became a Google map which he passed on to the authorities so that they could quickly identify where there were people in need of help. But what it then turned into was a map where he asked people to report how high the flood waters rose in each area. And this was something that didn't actually exist for Manila previously. And if the government had had to go out and do this, it would have taken them far longer. So actually in a very short period of time, we got a good sense of where are the problem areas in the future. When floods happen in the future, where are the, how high will the waters rise? And what does that mean for municipal planning, for example? So this is an example, similar to say, Fix My Street and other sites, of a way of gathering information from people in a way which is quick and easy for them to do. And the government can then take that information away and mash it up with other information and make a much stronger sense of what's needed. So this is a great example of this is a really great example of a crowdsourcing exercise, which genuinely gathered data which was difficult for government to get, which the public had access to, and simply by making it easier to feed it in, a very useful resource was developed. So we've had some interesting comments here throughout. That's really so. So Andy McGregor's come up with some good points, some interesting ideas about how selection, so elections could be changed, and selection could make sure that there's a balance of views. And I've heard similar views raised about the House of Lords. So community resilience, Sam, I agree with you. The examples do sit well with that. And does makes a very good point here about crowdsourcing. So Wikipedia is obviously a crowdsourced, and it's not new. I mean, in a way, we have this situation in the field where sometimes things that have been around a very long time get rebranded, and people, it often happens. We invent new words to describe old things, and hopefully we tweak them slightly so they're slightly better focused. But the enthusiasm for new things is often not entirely true, and that you can always go back and see that someone has pioneered it previously. So a question here from Sally about who's got the legitimacy and credibility to run local consultations. I'd say it's often good to get councillors, the decision makers, involved in the process, because if you want them to be influenced by the process, having them there at the event or there seeing it happen is a very powerful way of making sure that it's in their minds. Because if you take the consultation away and write it up into a 20-page report, which chances are the councillor will only read the executive summary of, there's a lot of good, rich information which gets lost there. So it's good to have them there. I've often found that, I mean, professional facilitators can be a good idea, especially if it's a very high conflict area where councillors might not seem to be neutral enough. Because obviously one of the things to recognize is that the councillors have many roles, and one of those roles is to be a champion for local causes. And if you're a champion for a local cause, then chances are you might not be the right person to be the neutral chair of an investigation into that topic. But of course, one thing which is missing here is the potential to perhaps have community groups, schools, and other people hosting the consultation. So one of the things we did when we worked in Lambeth was to take the money which the council would normally have spent on running events in council buildings and give them to schools to organize community fun days, which brought in a whole range of teachers, parents who would never have taken part otherwise. And they were able to source activities like face painting very cheaply in a way the council would never have done because they had the local contacts. And that's similarly to letting a local charity run things, or indeed, as I've said, seen sometimes, local papers hosting online discussion boards about issues. So there's a range of things you can do if you're willing to let go of control. And that's often one of the things that you see in these examples of radical engagement. So there's a range of interesting examples which we can look at, but it often is about being willing to give up control. So Isabel has asked, what difference do you think the Localism Act will make to community engagement? Well, as I said, there seems to have been a shift away from engagement in decision making and more towards, maybe not away from, but there seems to be more focus on engaging in order to inform actual service delivery and getting community groups to deliver services themselves. That's a big shift. And I mean, at the moment, we're looking at some cases where campaign groups who've been opposing library closures are now gearing up to actually deliver library services themselves. But obviously, that's a big challenge. And I think there is a gap to a degree between what we expect members of the public to do and what they're actually willing to do. The research I've seen seems to show that people are far less willing to actually go out and deliver things than they are to take part in conversations to shape services. So the community organizing work and the other work that is happening around building skills and confidence and ability of citizens will be important if we're going to see that happening, especially across the board, not just in the very affluent areas. So moving on to the next example of innovative radical engagement is the Citizens Initiative Review in Oregon. Now, many of you will know about citizens initiatives, where if a certain issue gets enough if a petition gathers enough signatures, they can force an issue either onto a referendum ballot or to be discussed in local council, for example. These are some of the most controversial reforms which have featured in the localism discussion, referendums and initiatives. Those are really key. The problem with citizens' initiatives is oftentimes, in the US, they have become the tools of wealthy lobby groups because it costs a lot of money to gather hundreds of thousands of signatures. There's also the issue of the fact that people are voting, especially when initiatives are linked to referendums, people are voting on issues that they don't understand. The wording might be badly formulated. People will vote on an issue not fully understanding what it is they're voting on, and then of course the referendum is often binding, and that can lead to all kinds of negative connotations if the citizens haven't fully understood what it is they're voting for. So one of the things that is happening right now in Oregon, which is very exciting, is they've instituted a reform which says whenever an initiative comes up for the ballot, that initiative gets put in front of a randomly selected deliberative citizens group who then look at the evidence, who listen to the experts, and then pass a citizen's verdict, which is automatically sent to all the voters in Oregon. Now, obviously, the voters can choose to disregard what the citizens' deliberations have shown, but it's giving citizens, especially those citizens who don't have the time or the inclination to actually understand exactly what's going on, it's giving them a tool, a cheat sheet, a chance to listen to what other citizens think about this issue, away from the pro or anti-propaganda put out by various organizers. So this is an example of where you're actually institutionalizing citizen engagement and deliberation. It's not tacked on to the end of a decision-making process. It's legally now mandated as part of the decision-making process. And it complements and strengthens the other strands, both the representative and the direct democratic processes in Oregon. Now, I realize this is kind of above and beyond what most councils can do here and now, but it is worth thinking about where does our neighborhood panel fit in the decision-making structure? Where do our advisory groups fit? Where do our participatory budgeting processes fit? Are they actually part and parcel of the decision-making process and the service delivery process? Or are they something that we've tacked on to the end of a decision process without really considering how it's going to have an impact? So here are these are some of the issues that we really need to address and work on. So if we go back and look at the examples, I'd say there are some lessons here from all of these. Imagine Croydon. It was all about the fun and informal forms of engagement, making engagement easy to do. Hopefully people don't even realize they're being consulted. Let's Do It Estonia was an example of a decentralized model where actually it was up to citizens to self-organize and do things. The America Speaks model was very much about deliberation and making sure that discussions are well informed. The Manila flood map is an example of networked engagement, where actually the sum of the whole is much bigger than the individual components. And the Citizens Initiative Review is a great example of an institutional reform. So we've had a few comments raised, one of which is from Sally about, are citizens' juries still alive and well across the UK, or are they being phased out? I think citizens' juries there was a brief period in the Gordon Brown era where they were the absolute rage and everyone was doing them. I think they're still happening. They're much less common. And that's partly because when you look at them, they're quite a labor-intensive approach. And you need to make sure that the issue that you're doing them on is significant enough and that the jury has an actual opportunity to influence the final thing. If you look at the kind of menu of options, they're like I guess they're like a very rich dessert, which you wouldn't want to use in all occasions. They're very selective, but they're still around, less prevalent than they used to be, and that's in part due to the fact that the costs are quite high, and few councils find they have that money. But the citizens' jury model or similar deliberative approaches do give results which you can't really replicate with any other means. So sometimes it's just a case of, well, you could run 1,000 public meetings and you wouldn't get what you want. So you'll have to look to going back to the purpose. In certain cases where the purpose, the context, and the participants point to a citizens' jury, then that's the method you should use. So I think underlying all of this, if I were to sort of summarize where I think the field of engagement needs to happen, needs to shift, I think is the old focus was very much about what's in it for government. What do we get out of this? It was about the short term, this policy needs to be delivered. How do we engage around that? It was very siloed around organization. You'd have citizens turning up to meetings in the hospital trust and then asking a question and then being told, no, that's the primary care trust, you're in the wrong meeting, which frustrates people because they don't think about it as organizations. And indeed, one of the most useful pieces of advice I can give people is, would you take part in your own consultations? And if the answer is no, then why are we running them that way? Whereas I think a shift has to happen towards what's in it for the citizen. Why would they take part? The longer term. So making sure that we're building for the future, that we're making this a focus on relationships, focus on the individual, and making sure that the hallmark of a good consultation is not what the feedback is on the day. It's not did the policy pass or fail. It's has this actually strengthened our relationship with these individuals long term and made them more likely to take part in the future. And if not, then that's actually undermining the longer-term success of the council. So to give you a sense, at the moment, the focus is very much the institutions there and the citizens are, the engagement is very much about the institution being at the center and the citizens interacting with it, and the institution sets the parameters. And what we need to move towards, I appreciate this is difficult, is a situation where the individual is at the center. And it's not just about one institution, but it's actually about all of these other institutions interacting with them, and the citizen sometimes responding to government and sometimes responding to and sometimes setting the agenda themselves. So that's the key shift I think we need to see. So in terms of recommendations, the things I would recommend people do at this quite difficult time, we're seeing massive cuts in the public sector, we're seeing challenges. The first thing and very important thing is to build the business case for public engagement. And we've done a report, a toolkit, which you can see in that URL there, which helps people articulate why it is that the engagement work they're doing is good. Because I know there's lots of good work that's happening, but in the good years, we rarely spent the time articulating the benefits of public engagement in terms of financial gains or monetary benefits, because we felt, well, a good democracy is enough in itself, and we don't need to justify it with financial means. Now, sadly, because of the financial situation we're in, I mean, these monetary arguments are very strong. And unless you can make a clear case for why cutting engagement or community development or whatever programs you've got running have severe impacts and cost implications further down the line, it can seem like a very quick win to cut it. If you cut school services, you're not going to get much in the way of negative feedback in the press. If you cut the consultation, if you cut schools, you'll get massive negative feedback. If you cut your consultation budget, it'll barely be noticed. So we need to find a way of articulating why this work is important in the current financial reality. And the toolkit is one way of doing that. Another thing to do is to obviously audit your practice, and there's a number of toolkits there that you can use. I think a number of our reports might be useful there. What that means is really just taking a hard look at what you're doing and almost applying a total place framework to understand, is there duplication? Oftentimes, different parts of the public sector will be running very similar processes in parallel at twice the cost. Are there things you're doing which actually are actively undermining what citizens want to do? So these are really interesting points. And you might want to stop doing certain things. Make sure you partner with others. And this is a link to a document called Not Another Consultation, which gives you lots of insights into informal engagement, how to make it fun. Evaluate and share. Make sure that you ask hard questions. Is this actually having the impact we want? And if not, change it. Don't go for the insanity of doing the same thing, expecting a different result. And that link the link next to that is our evaluation guide. Called Making a Difference. And then, of course, finally, just make sure you try and start with people, try and build those long-term relationships with individuals. So those are my recommendations based on what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing from people. Thought I'd end with another quote, which is from one of the big statesmen of Britain, Churchill, saying, well, courage is what it takes to stand up and speak, and it's also what it takes to sit down and listen. And I think that shift is what we need to see in government at the moment, and more of a willingness to engage in a two-way conversation and let go of control. So I hope that's been useful for you. I've given you a whirlwind tour of where we're at now in my view and where we might be headed, where I'm hoping we're headed, and some of the things you can do practically to change things. We've had about 35 people take part in this webinar, which I think is great. And if we have a similar turnout in the next one, we'll continue to run them throughout March and April. And the next one, as I said, is Sue Ritchie and Jane Lewis talking about positive deviance. And if you haven't heard of it, it's an absolutely fascinating approach to solving seemingly unsolvable problems in the local area by looking at what's currently working and how do you find the positive deviance. We spend so much time looking at the negative deviance, the people who cause problems, that we lose sight of the people who are actually making a massive difference in their community. So positive deviance is all about finding those positive deviants, the people who make amazing things happen in their communities, and then trying to learn what they do differently and try and do that across the board. It's a very powerful tool. It'll be a very fascinating webinar. I'm looking forward to it immensely. But after that, we've got another 3 or 4 sessions after that, which we haven't agreed anything on. So what would be great is if you were able to take this survey or just feedback to us either here in the chat forum or by email, what would you like these webinars to be about? Because these webinars are here to support you in your practice. So you might say, actually, I'd really like to hear more about social media. Or that Estonian process, Let's Do It Estonia, was absolutely fascinating. Can we do a whole session on that? The benefit of the webinar is I can contact people in the States or Australia or somewhere in Europe, and they can feedback their results and their insights in a way which is very cost effective. So it's an opportunity for you to shape this. It's about participation, but it is also participative. So I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on this. And Annie's really helpfully provided us with the survey link, which is fantastic. I'm just seeing if there's any more comments. Thank you for all your points. So by my clock, we've got a couple of minutes of questions. Now, I appreciate many of you have to get back to work, and that's fine. I hope it's been useful. Do let us know what you thought of it. It'd be very interesting to hear your views, and we will send out the slides to you if you've given us your contact details. So if you haven't, please email myself, Annie, or Tim at Involve about this work. And I'd just like to hear if anyone has any questions, any last comments, anything you'd like to add. Annie, have we got anyone who's got their hands up?
Nobody at the moment, no, but there's a few comments that I've been copying into the chat section.
Yep. So Sam's asked, so there's a question here about values. I mean, to what degree does community development, shift away from community development towards a consultation approach? I mean, I think that's the big negative result of that shift is obviously much less of a focus on the long term, because community development is very much about acknowledging that it's a longer term process. It's not a quick fix. I'd also say, I mean, there are a number of processes which, so community development, there's also participatory appraisal, which have come out of a particular values set. So participatory appraisal being a international development method. It's all about empowering poor people to have a voice. And a lot of practitioners are quite worried about what they feel is the dilution of those values when it becomes just a tool in a toolbox. So that's an ongoing debate, whereby there's, to what degree do we need to understand and embrace the values that go into a particular method in order to use it? And I've noticed that debate is raging at the moment around community organizing, which is being rolled out by government, but some of the old-time practitioners feel that it's also being diluted. So Sally's asked for some examples of participatory budgeting examples. I think that's an example of what would be quite easy seminar to organize. So if you think that's a good process to look at, then suggest it to us, and we'll put it. So Sally's put it on the agenda, and that's one of the ones we will definitely consider putting in. And if you agree with her, then let us know. And Giles made a point about massive cuts and how ordinary people should be involved. And I agree. And participatory budgeting is very important. There's been a really interesting debate about participatory budgeting, whether or not it's okay to use it when you're dealing with cuts. Because in a way, back in 2007, 2008, it was a very easy, nice form of participatory budgeting. We were using it was small pots of money, 70,000, 100,000 pounds in local areas, and people were asked, what would you like to use this discretionary spend to do? Now, there's not much conflict involved in it. Everyone likes to spend money. And in some ways, it's a much more difficult thing to do, to actually look at what should we cut? It's tough choices. But I do believe that if you give people the right information, you treat people with respect, you can ask them their views on some very difficult, complex issues. And indeed, let's not forget that Porto Alegre, where participatory budgeting started, is nowadays seen as this massive success story. But in '89, when they started the participatory budgeting, they were almost bankrupt. It was an act of desperation. So sometimes, difficult times, massive cuts, massive reductions, the sense of what are we going to do? We have no clue how we're going to solve this. Those are the times when fantastic innovations happen. And I believe, despite the difficulties we're facing, that is the situation that we're in. It's a difficult time, but also a very, very exciting time. So I hope this has been a good start to the webinar series. I hope many of you will join us in the coming sessions. And do let us know what you thought about this one. Do let us know what you want to do for the next one, because I think this series could be a tremendously useful thing. But in order to make it so, we really do need your views and your input. So, thank you all, and good luck out there. And hopefully I'll hear and see from many of you in 2 weeks' time. And do feel free to get in touch with us in between. Thank you very much.